going to get started. It's really a pleasure and an honor to welcome Oren and Ann back to the ISE. I had that they were based in Burlington and Williston, in sometime in the early 2000s, they started their current organization, the Global Justice Ecology Project, and redoubled a long-standing focus on supporting indigenous peoples' movements throughout the hemisphere. We started an international campaign that's still going strong that I'm sure we'll hear about, opposing genetic engineering of trees in forests and especially plantations. And Oren has been involved in countless movements and has been documenting them with his exceptional photography for decades, going back to the 70s, which is reflected in his book that's for sale on the table. And I can go on and on, but I'll turn it over to Ann and Oren.
It's nice to be here with everybody. And
great, thank you.
Great, thank you. It's nice to be here with everybody, and my name is Ann Peterman. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Global Justice Ecology Project, as Brian was just mentioning, which we founded in 2003 after many years of working on other issues related to indigenous people struggles and forest protection in the Northeast and especially Vermont. And one of the first things that we did in 1991 when Oren moved up to Vermont and we started working together was went and sought out the Abenaki because they were the original people here, and we wanted to, and they had had their land taken without their consent, and we wanted to talk to them about how we could support their struggle. And their struggle at that time was for state recognition. They were issuing their own driver's licenses, their own fishing licenses, and being dragged into court constantly. So we were doing media support for them. We were getting the word out about their struggle, and this went on for a few years, at least through 1992 and the beginning of 1993.
Not working?
I have to hit the play button.
Yeah.
And this is again Homer and the judge Michael Delaney in court. And after we were doing the Abenaki solidarity work, let me just reframe what we're talking about here. So what we wanted to, this is actually our 5th event in 6 days, so we're a little bit dingy at this point. But we really wanted to come back to Vermont because this is where we really got our start as radical activists. Not Oren got his start as a radical activist, but we got our start together as radical activists. And the idea of this presentation is really to talk about resistance. In this moment, in this country, in this world, we really need to be thinking about resistance. What does resistance mean? What is the history of some resistances that we're going to talk about here? Certainly a microcosm of what's been going on globally, but just to give an idea. So after we were working with the Abenaki, there was also this very major campaign in the state to be in solidarity with the Cree and Inuit people of northern Quebec to stop the damming of the Great Whale River. The damming of the La Grande River had already happened, and a bunch of Cree people had been displaced off of their island of Fort George into this little prefabricated, dusty town called Chisasibi. And after that, we went up to Great Whale itself and talked to people that were in resistance to this dam project. And at the same time, we were doing national and international organizing around forest protection issues and founded the Native Forest Network in Tasmania, Australia, and did the first North American Temperate Forest Conference in Burlington, Vermont, which brought together over 500 forest activists from around North America, along with indigenous people, and the Hydro-Quebec campaign was kind of the centerpiece of that conference. And after that conference was over, we organized an International Day of Action on Hydro-Quebec's 50th anniversary the following April. And following that International Day of Action, maybe a week later, Hydro-Quebec announced that they were putting the Great Whale Project on ice, and they never did build it. So that was an example of how solidarity can actually move issues. and make a big difference. Another major campaign that we were involved with here in Vermont, along with lots of other people in the state, was against the aerial herbicide spraying of Champion International's forest. They had proposed to the state that they would aerially spray their forested lands by helicopter with Roundup, glyphosate-based herbicide. And people, the governor said, oh yeah, sure, no problem, go for it. And people all over the state said, hello, no, that's not okay. And especially people in the area where the spraying was going to happen came out in force and said, no, this is not okay. So the governor appointed a commission, the Forest Resources Advisory Commission, that at the beginning of its tenure was 100% in support of limited spraying. And by the end of it, they did these public hearings all over the state. This one in particular is in Island Pond, and you can tell this kind of smarmy, slimy-looking guy here. He's from Monsanto, and he's talking about how safe Roundup is, and how you're safe enough to drink. And you're like, oh, we'll get you some. You show us. But people disrupted their hearings. They took them over. Bread and Puppet came and took over the hearing in Montpelier. It was really an amazing struggle all over the state. And at the end of the FRAC tenure, they were 100% in support of a moratorium on the spraying to do more study. And after they had this moratorium, after they announced the moratorium, Champion International, International Paper, and Boise Cascade all left the state. Sold their lands, left the state. So that was another major victory. Of course, we had to figure out, people had to figure out what to do with the Champion lands, and that was a whole nother issue that people addressed. But what struck us was when they left the state and later International Paper and Champion merged, they went to Brazil. And we said, oh, we didn't mean for that to happen. So now we're like, okay, well now we have to figure out how to do solidarity work with people in Brazil on this issue. And it took a while, but we have done a lot of work in Brazil, which I'll talk about in a bit. And another issue that we were working on with a lot of people around the state and also across the Northeast was against the National Forest Service. So trying to protect the Green Mountain National Forest from being logged, from road building, all of the things that the Forest Service is famous for. And we were part of a national campaign at that time, which was called Zero Cut. So forest activists all across the country were trying to stop all logging on the national forests. And it was a major campaign, and so this was our sentiment about the Green Mountain National Forest. This is their headquarter building in Rutland, Vermont. Destroy the Forest Service. And it was a pretty fun campaign. I think Brian was at a number of those gatherings and can attest that it was a really fun campaign and also accomplished quite a bit against the Forest Service.
On every one of the things you mentioned.
I think so.
So blame him.
And then the other thing that we did in the 90s, when the North American Free Trade Agreement was proposed, we were doing all kinds of organizing to try to raise awareness of what the impacts of NAFTA would be, the social impacts, the ecological impacts. We did actions at the border, the Canadian-US border. We did all of this work. And then on January 1st, 1994, the Zapatistas rose up, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, and we were like, wow, that's interesting. And they pointed out that NAFTA was going to be a death sentence for the indigenous peoples of Mexico. So we got very involved in that. Oren led a number of delegations down to Chiapas to do solidarity work with the Zapatistas, to raise awareness of what was happening with the Zapatistas, to get people plugged into supporting the Zapatistas in whatever way that they could. And Oren likes to point out when he was down there that the Zapatistas, the one thing that they asked people to do when people would say, what can we do? What can we do to support you? They would say,
go back to your countries and make room for make space for dialogue, which I think was a very important thing that is still very important today. And it's unfortunately, we live in such a divided country. It's hard to get sides to talk to each other, but it's good to see this many people here. I was going to mention too that Brian was at our house in Burlington at a New Year's Eve party at the time. I don't know if you remember that.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Anyway.
Good party.
Good party. It was a good party morning, the nap that we were going to be going through, that we all worked on it. And then got up in the morning, and one of the first things we heard is that a small group of indigenous people have just taken over the state of Chiapas and freed political prisoners that ruined court records and everything. And I mean, we got excited about that. That was a good way to bring in the new year.
So I'm going to pass it along to Oren. He's going to talk about the book Portraits of Struggle, which that's the cover of, obviously, which is photos from 1972 to 2023, North and South America, Europe, Africa, Australia, and Asia. So literally global resistance campaigns from 1972 to 2023.
Yeah, I don't have that many photos to show today. About most of the photos you're going to see and this whole presentation are mine, but these are the ones from the book. And that's Comandante Tacho from the EZLN. People think that that's like a portrait shot, and it really wasn't a set-up shot at all. We were in 2 different places. I was underneath one tent, he was underneath another tent, and I had my camera, and he looked at me from across the way, and I got the shot, and I was really happy because it did turn out very good. And we found out that some of the feedback we've got, bad feedback on the book, is this is a scary cover. But, the ski mask and the bandolero. And we were very much involved in the anti-corporate globalization movement. In 1999, I know a lot of organizing was done here to get people to go to Seattle. And actually, Ann and I didn't go to Seattle. We went to Chiapas, but about 2 weeks prior to that, we knew about the free trade area of the Americas, and the trade ministers from all the countries between Alaska and Argentina, the whole North and South America, got together and were having a big talk, one of the first talks about NAFTA, and we went up to Toronto and hung a banner, and in our press release, we just said we're firing the first shot, global shot against capitalism, a warning shot across their bow, and that was because, we knew Seattle was coming. So this is in D.C., A16. It was my birthday. It was a good birthday present. It was amazing. People were fighting the World Bank, because I'm sure you all know how screwed up the World Bank is, and at that time, there was a lot of energy spent on trying to get the World Bank to go somewhere else or defund themselves, or it was just to raise awareness, shut them down. And this was kind of in the heyday of the corporate globalization movement, which I think gave us all a lot of hope, and as the Zapatistas gave us all a lot of hope. But as you can see where we are today, but I think one of the main things we want to tell you is that there was resistance. This is in 2019. This is in Santiago de Chile in the People's Uprising, which was extremely wonderful. We were going down there to Santiago, or going to Chile, prior to even knowing this was going to happen, because we knew that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was going to be there, which Anne years before was thrown out of, and they never will let her back in again, which is good, so we don't have to go to those anymore. But we thought we'd go down to this one because we looked at each other and said, we have friends down there. They know how to party, and they know how to have a good street fight. Never did we realize this was going to happen. And when we got down there, they switched the venue from Santiago to Spain's Madrid. So this is it's very interesting going to the protests all throughout the state of Chile, the country of Chile. People were marching. People were always in the streets. It was, and it was a resistance going on And I'd like to point out that this guy here is playing some music for the people that were over here, and the people over here were throwing Molotov cocktails at a church, in the National Church. And one of the reasons they were doing that is because the National Police, the Carabineros, they all went there on Sunday Mass and got absolved of their sins. They also were shooting people in the face and blinding them. So there was not much love for the Carabineros or the church for that matter. This is in Santiago. Yeah, this is in Santiago also. There was a lot of tear gas. A lot of water cannons. The water cannons had not just water, but a caustic liquid that was some, I don't know what it was, but I don't know if we ever
Burned the skin.
It burned the skin. It was not very nice. But the people in the streets were happy. It was a great feeling of camaraderie, and the people just knowing that all the people were together. What they were trying to do is to get a constitutional assemblies together so the Constitution should be rewritten. And they were very, very successful and the Constitution at that time, and still, is from Pinochet. And so it's a screwy, fucked up deal. So COVID hit finally, and when COVID hit, a lot of the organizing had to be done, via email and stuff like that. There was quarantines all over the place. And the people's assemblies that came, they did get together, and a lot of them were led by Mapuche. Actually, I believe a Mapuche woman was one, which is a major indigenous people of Chile, did a good job of getting the assemblies going. Then COVID hit, and corporations somehow got involved, and politicians got involved. And that was the two things that the people who were fighting in the streets did not want. And so they passed another round of things saying that the Constitution could stay as it is. This man is Alberto Curamil. He stopped a few dams in Chile's Hydro-Quebec dams, and because of that, he was arrested coming out of a convenience store, saying people said he stole something, which was really highly unlikely. This is in Temuco, in one of his first hearings, I guess he'd call it. Was it the trial?
It wasn't the trial, it was the hearing.
Yeah, a hearing that after, I don't know how many years, was he in jail before the hearing? At least a year?
A year and a half.
A year and a half. He also, at this time, won the Goldman Prize for Environmentalism that is issued every year in San Francisco. Of course, he couldn't make it, but his daughter received it from the foundation or whatever it is. And anyway, he's out of jail now. It was really fortunate that he got out of jail. And since then, I think he's been back in jail a few times. There's a war going on against the Mapuche right now for being a Mapuche, and the Mapuche are in pretty heavy-duty resistance. So just another little quick thing. This is something that I'm doing right now. Oh, by the way, the field notes that says Episode 2, Militant Protests in Vermont, that's another thing we were all involved in. When the National Governors Conference came here in 1995, led by Howard Dean, I guess a couple of weeks or maybe a month beforehand, Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge signed the death warrant for Mumia Abu-Jamal, the political prisoner. And so some of us organized huge protests that took over the streets of Burlington for about a week. I mean, we were major TV coverage. The Burlington Free Press came out with a statement or an editorial talking about Mumia being a cop killer, and we basically made them retract that and say, well, you can't say that because how do you know? And so they retracted it to saying that he was wanted, or he was convicted of murdering a policeman. And unfortunately, he's still in jail. But when this whole thing was over, here, these two guys, good friends of ours, they were trying to stop Bill Clinton's motorcade going through. Make a long story short, we really upset the government on this. And one of the people we worked with from the IWW said, we not only rained on Governor Dean's parade, we pissed on it. And I wrote about that in some anarchist publications, and that was fun. And this is the book in Spanish, Retratos de Lucha. This is a Lonco, or a spiritual leader of a community there, a community in resistance. We were very, very fortunate to have these books. We came down with one of the people actually who lives in Chile, made all the arrangements for us, and it was a really scary time because there was a military, basically, occupation of the whole Wamapu, which is what the Mapuche call their territory. I don't know, how much do you want to get into this now, or do you want to?
Okay, you just pass it over.
Huh?
To me?
Yeah. Okay, so I will pass it over to Ann, because she's going to talk about that more. And we're happy to talk more about the Chilean resistance, too, after we're...
Yeah, and just to mention one of the things that Oren didn't mention about the protests for Mumia, after they were done, Governor Dean called us an embarrassment to the state, which as anarchists we were quite happy about. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about Mapuche territory. It's in Chile. Chile, of course, being at the southern tip of South America, and the Mapuche territory is kind of right in the middle of that long strip of land. So it's very rich land, and it's basically south of the Biobío River. And this graphic shows you on the left here, the bright green is traditional Mapuche territory. And on the right, the dark red is industrial timber plantations. So pine and eucalyptus plantations. In the 1860s, up until the 1860s, the Mapuche were living an autonomous life. And in the 1860s, the government of Chile decided, we want their land. So they began what they called the pacification of the Araucanía, which meant they went in and they executed a lot of people, they displaced communities, they forced communities onto reservations. It was a lot of massacres. It was a horrible time, and a lot of Mapuche people were separated from their traditional lands. And it was at that time that people began to lose their language, their culture, their spirituality, all of these things that were intertwined with the land. And that then was exacerbated when Augusto Pinochet took power with the help of the CIA in 1973, because he passed a forestry law that subsidized the conversion of all of these traditional Mapuche forests into industrial timber monocultures of pine and eucalyptus. Eucalyptus not even being native anywhere but Australia area, and the pine that they use, radiata pine, is not native to Chile. So, they went from these lush, incredibly rich native forests that provided food, medicine, shelter, et cetera, to these industrial timber plantations that provide nothing. They're biological deserts. In Brazil, they call them green deserts because they actually have nothing growing in them. They suck up all the water. They're basically dead. In Chile, they call them green soldiers because they're destructive and deadly and moving steadily forward and taking over land. This is the Mapuche territory. So this is one of the territories that we went to in 2019 where people, during the National People's Uprising, Mapuche people were also recovering their own lands. And this was one territory that we went to, Quelape Lopez, and this is it was framed by volcanoes. Their traditional territories, unbelievably beautiful. And you can't really see it very well in this photo, but the middle ground, that's sort of grayish green, those are all pine plantations. So in the foreground, you can see there's some native forest, and in the middle ground, it's all pine plantations. These are the traditional ancient Araucaria forests, which grow up in the Andes and at the higher elevations, and Oren and I spent 7 hours hiking through them one New Year's Eve in 2004, and they are just the most spectacular, huge trees. You expect to see dinosaurs in them. They're just hard to describe them. They're just amazing. This is the Cautín River. It's a sacred river to the Mapuche people. This is the river that Alberto Coramil stopped hydroelectric dams from being built on, which was why he was framed and ended up in jail for so long. This is Lake Yuyu. which is in the center of the Mapuche resistance where people have been recovering their territory. And this is the largest lake in Chile that's completely controlled by Mapuche people. So they've taken all the land back all the way around this lake. And in fact, we're taking the shot that this is, the land where this is shot is taken from is a school, a traditional Mapuche school where they're reteaching children the language, the spirituality, etc. And this is a greenhouse, so they're also teaching them food sovereignty and how to grow their traditional crops. On the far side, where there's like a little nook, you can sort of see, that was where Pinochet had a torture center. So it's an area with mixed history. And this is a eucalyptus plantation, so you can see what we're talking about. You can see the little tiny car right there. That was Nico. He was part of our delegation. He was leading us through this eucalyptus plantation. So the native forests that are there have been replaced with these highly destructive eucalyptus plantations that are not just biologically destructive, they're also explosively flammable. And in 2017, we went down to Chile and to document the worst wildfires in the country's history that had been in the 2016-2017 fire season. And since then, in 2023 fire season, again, they had the worst wildfires ever in the country's history. So these explosive tree plantations combined with droughts and heat waves caused by climate change are causing these immense conflagrations, which at first they were calling megafires in Chile. Now they call them gigafires because they're just unbelievably large and horrific. And then, of course, this is what we end up with. The community just downstream from this had asked us, please come and document this. And the reason that they did is just behind this wall of slash here, there's a ravine with a stream. And there's laws in Chile that you're supposed to have 100-foot buffers around the streams. You can't cut closer than 100 feet, but of course the timber companies don't care. So they just cut everything, and so the community downstream had no water as a result of the plantation plus the abusive logging practices. So they asked us, please come and document what's going on here. And this wasn't the big timber company called Arauco. This was actually a US-based company, and I cannot remember the name of it. Was it?
I believe it was Hamilton.
Hamilton? We'll have to look it up. I don't remember right now. And this was 2019. This was the community that was reclaiming its land, recovering its land. They said, they were taking advantage of this huge upswell of activism all over the country to go in, and lots of communities, lots of Mapuche activists were reclaiming their communities' original lands. And it was a pretty exciting time for us to be there with them. And they showed us a lot of their traditional culture and activities and spirituality. This was a sacred ceremony for the Andean condor, which is a sacred bird to the Mapuche. They allowed us to photograph and film it, which was pretty special. And it was an amazing time for us. Go back for a second. But what we were there for 2 days documenting the community, and then there was a national park nearby, kind of where that volcano was I showed you earlier. And we were in that national park, just taking some, photos and kind of relaxing, B-roll and relaxing for a little while. And Alejandra, who was one of our delegation members from Chile, gets a call from the community saying, the Carabineros have just invaded, they're starting to shoot people, we need somebody here. So we nearly turned around and drove back and got stopped by the military police at a checkpoint. They wouldn't let us through. And Alejandra is like, I'm a human rights observer, I'm going. And, because the community was only about, 3 kilometers up the road. So I'm like, oh, I'll go with you. And so I go. And meanwhile, Oren and Gary, and Gary spoke Spanish, he was part of our delegation. They managed to convince the national police that they were officials, so they got to drive in while we were...
No, they didn't. No, they turned us away.
Oh, you went through a secret...
We went through Mapuche community. We visited the day before. And as soon as they saw us coming, they just started waving us and pointing down roads, and there were people waiting for us and go that way, and then finally we had to walk to what was going on. But and then Alejandra.
We showed up a little while later, all covered in sweat.
Yeah. So.
But and this was all happening on U.S. Thanksgiving Day, which we thought was quite ironic. Well, not ironic so much as what would be the word. Appropriate.
Prophecy.
Yeah, something like that. Oops, wrong click. Okay, and this is back in 2004. This was one of our first trips down to Chile where we were trying to document the impacts of eucalyptus plantations and industrial tree plantations on the Mapuche people. And this was Alfredo who was leading our delegation, and we saw this brand new plantation of eucalyptus trees, and so he's doing a little bit of a direct action himself, stomping on the trees. But this is what the Mapuche people are up against. So because they're reclaiming their territory and they're doing so in a way that does not exclude property damage, let's say, they, you know, some of the organizers, or not organizers, some of the activists burn log trucks and do these other actions against the timber company to try to get them off their territory. And as a result, you know, the government and the military and the timber companies use this as an excuse to have full-scale military occupation of the Mapuche territory. And it was quite stunning to see, you know, the checkpoints. People were testifying to us. Back up for a second. The book, Oren showed you the Retratos de Lucha, the book that we were in Spanish, that we were passing out to the Mapuche communities. On this delegation, this was like our 7th time to Chile, we wanted to explicitly document people's stories about the repression. That was kind of an area that we hadn't really dug into before. We looked at the impacts of the plantations, we'd looked at, you know, the wildfires, we'd looked at the water, all of these different pieces of the puzzle, but we hadn't specifically looked at the repression. So that's what we wanted to do this time. And we would go to these communities and say, can you please talk to us about this military repression that you're experiencing? And they'd be like, well, who are you? Why do we want to talk to you? And so we would give them the book, and they would look through it and like, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, we'll talk to you. Yeah, you clearly know what you're doing. You've been doing this for a long time. So we got some very candid interviews with people on video, and Oren took photos, and we actually got to go into some of the prisons and interview the political prisoners. They didn't let the cameras in, of course, but we went, those of us without cameras went in and talked to the political prisoners. It was really a rich, very powerful trip for us to learn what was going on with the repression. Unfortunately, then we came back and we started putting this together into videos and, you know, doing outreach and support for the solidarity work for the Mapuches that were being targeted for repression. And then it turned out that the people that we talked to were being arrested. So people, specifically people who we had interviewed, were being arrested and charged. And they were like, can you please take our videos down, because we were, you know, telling you things and now they're going to use those things against us in court. It's like, okay. So we did, and now we're kind of stepping back, taking all of the information that we gathered in October 2024, which is when we were down there, and trying to figure out how we can move forward without further endangering people and still, you know, build solidarity for their struggle. It's a bit of a complicated situation.
I did a photo essay on it that we did get published in a social documentary network, and then the Global Forest Coalition was going to publish it. It would have been published right about now, and it was going to be, I think, in 6 different languages, and it was all about, everything was about the Mapuche and the struggle. And so I had to pull all of that because, you know, we didn't want to get, we had to protect the people we talked to. And so we have documented history, and that may be all it ever is, who knows? But anyway, I digress.
Yeah. So anyway, we're trying to figure out what we can best do. Interestingly, Oren had a photograph. He brought some photographs down to the Mapuche communities, Quelape Lopez and Yempe Colipi, where we had gone in 2019 and where all this, you know, activity happened that we had described a minute ago. We went back to those communities in 2024 to see how they were faring now. They'd recovered their territory in 2019, what was going on now. And we brought some photographs, Oren brought some photographs that he had printed from that trip in 2019. And one of them was 2 young brothers. They were like 16, 17 years old. And he gave it to the Lonco in Quelape Lopez. And the Lonco said, he told us, oh yes, these 2 brothers, 2 weeks ago, they were both arrested and put in prison for some kind of trumped up charges. That's the interesting thing about, so there's a lot of direct action going on. The authorities really don't care who did the direct action. They use it as an excuse to target the leadership in the Mapuche resistance. So they just grab whoever they want to, say, you did this, and they put them in prison. And they call it preventative prison because people can be in prison for almost 2 years before they get a trial. So there are all kinds of Mapuche people who are active, especially youth, from ages like 18 to 24 that are in prison because they were grabbed, and basically the state is trying to break the back of the Mapuche resistance. So that's part of the story that we're trying to figure out how to tell in a way that's not making things worse. In the 70s, when the pine plantations really started taking hold under Pinochet, many of the young children saw this happening, saw all of their forests, their beautiful forests, being taken away and replaced with these industrial tree monocultures. And in the 90s, when they were in their early 20s, they formed an organization. I can't remember what it stands for right now, but it's CAM, and it's a coordinated Mapuche resistance organization of youth who were, it was really, I mean, if you should probably Google CAM and the Mapuche. They have these incredible statements of, their political philosophy and stuff, really high-level thinking that was going on among the Mapuche about bringing back the land and bringing back their spirituality and their language and their food. And, the first thing they do when they take back their land is plant their traditional crops. He said, that's first. First we have to do that. Then we bring back our spirituality. Then we bring back our language. And they're really interesting. It's been a really interesting thing for them to be doing, and another reason why they're being so targeted. Because it's not just direct action, it's direct action with a philosophy behind it, right? A very powerful philosophy behind it. So we got to meet with Héctor Dietul in the Concepcion prison, who's one of the founders of this organization, CAM, who's been in and out of prison for a long time. And he recently got charged with 15 years in prison, found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison because he, as a spokesperson for CAM, spoke out supporting a direct action where some logging equipment had been burned. And because he supported it, he was put in prison for 15 years. So the United States is not the only place where free speech is not so embraced. This is his wife/lawyer. We visited Héctor with her, and she talked to us about the repression against the families of the Mapuche political prisoners. They put them very far away from their families, so the families can't come and visit, and then they create all these roadblocks for the families that are trying to visit. And one of the roadblocks prevented Héctor's son, this is his son, I can't remember his name right now, who wanted to come in with us and was not allowed. And that's his grandson. So they were having another protest against the political prisoner, the model of political prisoners in Chile while we were inside. This is Juan Pichun. We met with his brother, Rafael Pichun, in the Temuco prison. He's been a political prisoner for a long time. Another person who was a spokesperson for CAM and arrested because he was a spokesperson. And Juan Pichun is the lonco of this community, the spiritual leader. That's his mother next to him. They were talking to us about the repression in their community. And maybe a month before we got there, or a couple weeks before we got there, 2 weeks before we got there, the Carabineros, the national police, had invaded this community and invaded the school, the kindergarten, with full body armor and weapons, and burst into the school, as a form of basically terrorism against the Mapuche community, because of the connection of the Pichun family, which has been a target of Chile for a long time. And just about a month ago, Juan Pichun, the man on the right there, was arrested and put in prison with his brother Rafael in Temuco under some trumped up charges. So it's really incredible what's going on there. And what is even more shocking is this is all happening under Gabriel Boric, who is a supposed leftist president. He was a student mobilization organizer in college in Santiago, and he was a student leader, and because of the whole People's Uprising, the Constitution was voted down, but he was voted into office. It was sort of a compromise of the ruling class. And he's been horrible, just absolutely horrible to the Mapuche. He passed, under his administration, they passed a law called the usurpation law, which makes Mapuche land recovery efforts illegal and targets even more people for arrest. He's been awful. But in Chile, presidents only have one term, then they have to elect a new president. And the president that looks like it will be elected this time is a guy named Cast, who is super right-wing and literally the son of a Nazi who escaped to Chile after World War II. So they're going to have a German Nazi running Chile if things don't turn around. And our friends in Chile are not very hopeful because apparently the left is running somebody very bad. And this is all for, of course, timber products. Arauco is the big company there. This is at a tree genetic engineering conference in Maryland last year. Our products are born from renewable sources, blah, blah, blah. And this is literally the slide from the keynote presentation at that genetically engineered tree conference. Let's teach nature something new. They're making designer lignins with the idea that they can take these tree monocultures, these pine and eucalyptus plantations, change the lignin in the trees so they can make the trees into anything they want, into fuel, textiles, plastics, chemicals, engineered wood, cement, whatever. They want to use wood as the feedstock for all of these different things, and the way they're going to do it is by genetically engineering designer lignins to then re-engineer into the trees. It's just like bonkers stuff. But again, it's like, all right, so I think the world knows we need to protect and leave standing the forests that are standing now, and yet the trend of industry is to create all of these massive new demands for wood. It's like, okay, how do you, and all of this is under the umbrella of let's stop climate change, right? So making things out of wood is going to stop climate change, protecting forests is going to stop climate change. And of course, this leads us back to Vermont, where we are fighting the genetically engineered American chestnut tree. And the genetically engineered, how many people have heard about the genetically engineered American chestnut tree? Not bad, pretty good. It is, if it got approved, right now it's in the approval process, if it was approved, it would be the first genetically engineered plant anywhere on the planet to be allowed to be released into the wild with no regulations or monitoring to spread itself forever, potentially.
That we know of.
That we don't, yes. Yeah, of course. We don't know, what the corporations are doing, on their own, or what researchers are doing that they don't tell us about, we don't know. But we'd be the first one that would be officially approved. So we've been fighting it really hard, and it is a massive and irreversible experiment. This is what they want to approve. This is the Darling 54. This is what it looks like. This is the thing that the researchers at the College of Environmental Science and Forestry have come up with that they say is going to bring back the American chestnut to forests all over the eastern United States. And, it's a quarter of them die when they are genetically engineered with this defective genetic trait. And a lot of them look like this. It's just the reason that they're doing it, they just want the precedent. They want the precedent of getting it approved so that they can get all of these other things without any approval process whatsoever. So that's the whole purpose of it. It has nothing really to do with this particular tree. It has to do with just opening the doors wide to genetically engineered chestnuts specifically, but GE trees writ large. And this just is the last slide. This is the traditional range of the American chestnut. And they were wiped out at the beginning of the last century by a chestnut blight that was introduced from Asia. But they still exist. There's still 4 million documented in the forests of the South. And from here, we're actually going to some land in Maine. It's a 600-acre plot of land in Maine where American chestnuts, this naturalist named Bernd Heinrich, planted 4 wild American chestnuts from Michigan that had some level of blight tolerance, on his land 40 years ago, and now there are literally thousands of American chestnuts growing. And they are, according to Rachel, who's the scientist friend of ours who was married to Barrett and goes up there a lot, there's no sign of blight. So, you know, the chestnuts are coming back on their own. They're coming back to Massachusetts, they're coming back in Vermont, they're coming back in New England. And I believe...
And right here in Plainfield.
Is it really? Right here in Plainfield? Excellent. And the reason that that's the case, in my opinion, is because climate change is pushing the chestnuts north. So the projections for the coming decades is that the chestnuts are going to go right up through New England and into the eastern Maritimes, and that they're not going to be so much in the south anymore. And so, you know, pointing out how well the chestnuts are doing right here in New England is really important to pointing out why we do not need that defective little tree, you know, being approved and opening the door to all kinds of other genetically engineered chestnuts that will have who knows what kind of problems that we will not be able to stop and reverse in the forests. So that is it. That is the whole shebang. But the whole idea, as I said, of doing this presentation is talking about ongoing resistance. It's talking about, you know, here we are in the United States right now in a situation that looks pretty bleak. But when we come back, you know, we talk about, when we look at situations like what's going on in Chile and other places in the world that we've been doing a lot of work in Brazil and elsewhere, you know, it's a woman who's on our staff is from Mexico, and she's indigenous, and she says, you know, we've been dealing with this for 500 years. You know, you maybe you're new to this, but we're not new to this. This has been going on, and you know, you will survive this. You know, don't worry so much. You will survive this. It won't be pretty, but you will survive this. And I don't know how many people watch The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Oh, come on.
It's okay.
Well, anyway, there was a comedian on one of his shows the other day who said, "What is this, your first dictator?" So anyway, it's an interesting time for us. It's a very interesting time for us to be in the resistance, and we're so honored to be here and talking to you all. And we'll stop talking now so we can have conversation.
So we have about 30 minutes for questions and discussion. Let's open it right up. I see Blair and then Frank.
Great presentation, a lot of food for thought. So I had two interrelated sets of questions. The first one, so are the Mapuche united in their opposition to like industrial logging there, or are there different communities or interests within communities that some are embracing that, some are opposing it? Because my family comes from the Suquamish tribe, and most indigenous societies I know in the United States, they're not monolithic, right? They have different interests, they're class societies like everyone else. So I'm curious if the Mapuche are in fact quite as united, or some are like, no, let's actually develop this for economic or whatever reasons. And then the second one was about the last slide, especially the one, let's teach nature something, or something new. And I was really thinking about Murray Bookchin and dialectical naturalism, which the whole idea is to consciously guide evolution. And I was also thinking about RFK is kind of like anti-vax discourse, that it's not natural. And so I'm curious like how ecologists can think about things like that without falling into assumptions of like what's natural, what's not natural. I mean, where do you draw that line? Like, you know, Mendelian hybridization has been going on for a very long time. So what separates GE from that? How do we not fall into, you know, certain languages? You mentioned, for example, I mean, the pictures were interesting, but what is the actual problem with hybridized chestnuts besides being defective, which is a language that already, for me, sets off some alarm bells. So thinking, I don't know, socially, ecologically about those two questions about where politics reside in people or in ideas or whatever, what generates resistance, and then also how we think about the nature philosophy underpinning our resistance.
Okay. So we got about another hour, right?
A week.
Well, starting with the first question about the Mapuche, we have not met any Mapuche people who are in support of the industrial forestry model. How people resisted varied widely. Some people are working with the government, trying to reclaim their communities through the government process. There is a government process. It's extremely slow, and it's not very many communities have success with that in a given, let's say, in a given year. So many communities they've been waiting and waiting and waiting, they don't want to wait anymore. So that's a very short answer to that question, but I would say, I can't say 100% of Mapuche people oppose industrial timber plantations, but certainly we have never encountered anyone who was even remotely in favor of them.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there are Mapuche that support it. I mean, I like Ann said, we haven't met any, but you can't just classify one group of people as all united in things. And there are actually 3 Mapuche factions. The one are the people that are going to trying to get the land back through all legal means, and others are for direct action, and like Hector Latul and Cam. And then there's another group of Mapuche who are basically ready for war, I would say. What do you?
Yeah, there's more a group that's more along a very small group that's like preparing for armed struggle, let's say it that way. But yeah, so there's, like I said, a very wide spectrum of action in the Mapuche. So then back to the question about the genetically engineered American chestnut. I'll give you my read on it. The genetically engineered, the D54 that I was showing you on the screen there is literally defective. So it's not just that it's genetically engineered, they screwed it up. They used, long story short, the College of Environmental Science and Forestry gave the American Chestnut Foundation, who they were working with and who was doing field trials for them, gave them the wrong pollen 7 years ago. They were supposed to give them pollen from the Darling 58. They gave it to them from the Darling 54, which had a lot of issues, wasn't the one that they were supposed to be using. And the Darling 54 has a whole gene deleted. So it's missing this gene for drought tolerance. And as a result, it's just had, it doesn't grow well. A lot of them die, and they said it's just not even the American Chestnut Foundation, which is completely pro-genetic engineering, said it is not an appropriate restoration tree. And they pulled their support for it, although recently they've gone, anyway, I won't get into that, but they're going in a weird direction right now, the organization. So that's the short answer, and then the longer answer is, obviously this is nothing, genetic engineering has nothing to do with hybridization, right? I mean, one is using traditional breeding methods to come up with different varieties, right, of species. And then this is actually, of course, in a lab, interfering in the genetic material in a way that doesn't happen in nature. With gene editing, that's like the new thing now, and industry's arguing that it's not genetic engineering because it's DNA free. But it's still going in there with their RNA scissors and snipping out genes or moving them around in ways that, first of all, they don't know what's going to happen, and second of all, would not happen in nature. So for us, it's like there's all of these unknowns. We don't know what these things will do when they're released into the wild, when they're released in the environment at all. They're genetically engineering microorganisms, and people are talking about like, well, how do you control that? If these things get out in the environment. So there's a lot of and the genetically engineered lignans, I mean, that is creating completely synthetic lignans, like using AI to manufacture lignans, reinsert them into trees so that the lignin will, in the trees, so that the wood in the trees will do things, whatever they want. Be easily digested into ethanol, be stronger for building, be better for burning, whatever. It's a very weird concept that you would synthesize lignin and then put it back into a tree. I don't know. I don't know if that answers your
I
question.
can add a little
Please,
bit,
please.
that might be helpful. We used to, of course, talk about this a lot back in the early 2000s when a lot of us at the ISC were very active in anti-GMO work, including helping get this campaign off the ground. And, the ideology of the corporations that are promoting genetic engineering relies on an extremely oversimplified understanding of genetics. They would have us believe that genetic traits are like snippets of sentences in a computer, or lines in a computer program that you could cut and paste and remove and add, and that we can think about genetics in this very oversimplified industrial model way that is completely at odds with everything we've learned about genetic regulation in the last 50 years. It turns out that genetic regulation at the cellular level is very dynamic, interactive, you could maybe even say dialectical in a way, and that the kind of simplistic interventions that the GMO industry has been pushing for from the beginning have unintended effects that are not easy to monitor, that the companies looking to produce products have very little incentive to monitor, and that add, like I was saying, an array of unanticipated problems.
My point, though, is you hear those very same arguments from RFK about mRNA vaccines, right? So where do you draw the line between like what's natural, what's unnatural, manipulation of genetic codes, all that? He's also a former ecologist of some kind. So, I mean, this is like a philosophical question that, I think social ecology should be grappling with and not rely on like, well, it's natural, it's not natural, I know, but I see it. Humans have been, consciously intervening and changing nature for a very, very long time, and I think environmentalists often have kind of a conservative orientation, which is probably warranted in a lot of regards, but I think, as science and technology develops and as we see large swaths of the environmental movement break rights, including like ecologists, including people like RFK, and a lot of, like anti-vax people. So how do we like grapple with those questions and not fall back to this? I mean, I'm asking because I'm really curious. Like we need, I think, new tools and a new language to think about those things so we don't open ourselves up to the RFK and the alt-right soccer mom health,
Absolutely, absolutely. And for me, the key is trying to understand in as much detail as possible the underlying logic of the natural processes that we're intervening in. And the oversimplified corporate model, I would argue, is in defiance of the logic of those processes, as opposed to a whole host of interventions that are perfectly reasonable, that follow the logic of those processes. And the science over the last 50 years has given us an increasingly sophisticated understanding of that. And I think looking at the science systematically supports the arguments, for example, in favor of mRNA vaccines, even though, there are people in our extended circles who disagree. And science is contested, inherently contestable, going back to Latour's work in the 80s, which a lot of us have followed closely. But we can try to draw distinctions between interventions that are complementary to the underlying logic of natural systems and interventions that go against them.
Yeah, first I want to say I'm glad that this question was raised in the first place. I found myself thinking a lot of the same thoughts around like the language that, I agree with, that there's a philosophical critique of the simplification of genetics and sort of this logic that we can go in and manipulate them. But to your point, I forget, sorry, to catch your name, but right, like interested in the potential for co-optation that we do see in a person like RFK, like was, there in Vieques and helped kick the U.S. Marines out of a colony, and yet can still become a reactionary within the span of 20 years. And I'd like to also hear, an expansion on the critique that I think Ann and I heard you raising briefly I'm super interested in this because full disclosure, I went to ESF. I'm not part of the forestry department. I have no, I do not care about the American Chestnut Project. But I'm curious because you started to articulate this critique that of how this really just opens the door for once a genetically modified, tree crop like the American chestnut is allowed to proliferate and start expanding on its own. It creates a precedent that, in my mind, I can imagine, and the forestry companies and the like, sort of, using that logic to say, okay, let's own and let's privatize and let's begin to own genetics, which I think is something we're all, many people would be concerned about, right, on a philosophical and economic level. And so I wonder, just getting back to the potential of co-optation with these wild restoration efforts that are really cool. It's the first time I've ever heard of it, in Maine, and it's really interesting to hear about. Are there any conversations or active efforts in, get in front of, okay, if there is a wild population of American chestnut being restored, how do we still prevent, is there a way to prevent the return of that tree wood crop as, being co-opted by industry and being, I hope I'm articulating this thought well, maybe not.
Well, I think, okay, so backing up a little bit, we didn't have a lot of time to spend on just the American chestnut because that's, an hour and a half presentation by itself. But, going back, the reason that the American chestnut was chosen as a tree to genetically engineer was not entirely altruistic, right? So way back in the beginning, the New York chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation, which has from its get-go been completely in favor of genetically engineering the American chestnut, actually made an agreement with Monsanto. So Monsanto was going to provide technological support for this process. Bill Powell, who was the head of the chestnut program at ESF, there was a Monsanto volunteer in the lab supporting their work. They worked with ArborGen. ArborGen, helped sent technological support to them as well. So ArborGen was the largest GE tree production company in the United States. They've now largely relocated outside of the United States because of public opposition. But, so it's never been an altruistic tree. It was always about companies trying to come up with a tree that would convince the public, the American public and the global public, that genetically engineering trees could be done for good purposes. And the reason for that was because, as Brian was saying, we've had this campaign since 2000 and had this enormous public opposition all over the world against industrial GE trees, eucalyptus, pine, poplar, etc. These monocultures that we were talking about, that the next iteration of those would be genetically engineered to resist insects. So in other words, produce Bt toxins and other toxins, to resist herbicides, in other words, Roundup and glyphosate, and basically make the problems of these plantations even worse for the communities that live near them. People didn't like that, so they said, okay, let's back up. And I'm not just saying this because it's something I believe. This is, I've been to industry workshops where they talked about this. They created a survey of public opinion, and they went out to all of these different people to see how they could get people to endorse the idea of genetically engineering trees. And climate change and forest restoration were two of the areas that they found people would be most receptive to. So, for us, not only do we follow the science, as Brian was talking about, we also follow the money. Who's behind this? Who's trying to make this happen? And in the case of the genetically engineered chestnut, it's always been the big corporations that have been funding it, providing money to ESF to pay for it. Anyway, it's been very interesting to follow that. And so, yeah, so the USDA is looking at potentially deregulating this D54 American chestnut. And if they do that, the way the law works is any other iteration of that tree, the Darling 58, the Darling whatever, the Darwin trees that use the same genetic tweak, the OXO gene from barley, from wheat, excuse me, they would just be given a free pass. So that's the issue, is it wouldn't just be this one tree, it would be this tree and anything else that uses the similar technology that would come along in the future. And now, you know, the USDA is such a mess under the current administration, although it's always been a mess, that it's hard to say what they're gonna do. They've decided they don't need to follow NEPA anymore, so, the National Environmental Policy Act. So they don't need to do environmental impact statements, which means the public won't have any input opportunities anymore. They're already gonna be sued about that, it looks like, but I hope that answered your question. I'm kind of, it's such a big issue, it's hard to answer it concisely.
I think with Trump in, he's going to let, you know, everything get by without, all he has to do is sign another executive order and allow genetic engineering. There's not, I can't believe, I'll stop there, but I mean, I do think that I'm not so sure that they're not genetically engineered trees already growing in different places. I'm very much of a skeptic. I know that the campaign itself does not go for what I'm just saying, but I do not trust corporations. And there's so much money involved. We were down in Chile last year looking at the monocultures and what it's doing to indigenous communities. The year prior to that, we were in Brazil, and I have never seen anything like it. The huge, that will, just as far as you can see for miles and miles and miles of eucalyptus, and nothing is growing there, nothing is wild except these trees, and they just cut them down and replant, cut them down and replant. And they want to replant with genetically engineered trees, and there's just a fortune to be made in this. And to me, I just can't envision personally anything that good can come out of this.
Let's go back to Frank, who had his hand up earlier, and then I saw Alexis and Eleanor and somebody, and
We want to take
Laura.
a few comments. So why don't you take-
Yeah, let's, that's a good thought. Let's take 3 comments and have responses all at once.
I have a question about the Mapuche struggle and sort of discourse in Chile. I was in Montreal recently, and I went for the Grand Transition Conference, which is really interesting. Folks haven't been there, and there was a lot of conversations around indigenous struggles in Canada right now, and the revival of the oil and gas industry, and how a lot of these projects that were put on the back burner in the 90s and the 2000s are now coming back. They're on the front burner in what is supposed to be reaction to Trump, right? Like the administration in Canada is supposed to be very liberal, or not very liberal, but there was a backlash politically in Canada to the right that was aligning itself with Trump. People got very scared, and then we now have sort of a center-left. I mean, it's hard to, I don't even use the word left, but what is supposed to be a center-left president in power, and under the pretense of combating the US oil and gas industry, the government in Canada is reviving all of these old projects. And ironically, apparently, a lot of those executives in the Canadian oil and gas industry have connections to the Trump administration. So they're manipulating the discourse of it being, well, we need energy autonomy. And suddenly indigenous movements in Canada are really seeing a steep rollback of the autonomy that they were supposed to receive through legislation over the last 20 years or so. I was really struck by, just a lot of the images in your presentation and the overlap with the Wet'suwet'en resistance and again, sort of this very aggressive, this newly aggressive or revival of very, very aggressive tactics on behalf of the Canadian government. And again, it was striking how that was in a framework of being a left-wing endeavor that was pursuing energy autonomy in reaction to Trump. And I was just curious, sorry, a long question, if there was a similar kind of dynamic in Chile, right, of like extractivism, you know, we're left-wing, but that means we need to build up our national industry and we need to extract through our own, you know, our own sort of national interests. And I was curious if you were seeing a similar dynamic there.
So Alexis and then Cora, I think.
I'll forfeit. Oh, I wanted to also ask about indigenous resistance, which I've been reading a lot recently about one of the earliest in New England, what is known as King Philip's War, the indigenous resistance to colonization, which settler colonization was taking land, cutting down forests for the interests of the settlers. And so in your experience, in your decades-long working with indigenous people and their conceptions of and how they do resistance, I'm wondering for this moment at this time, what should we be focusing on learning on or thinking about from their, what you see, what values, or I don't know about if it's tactics and strategy, but maybe big picture approaches to the idea of resistance to this overwhelming force of consumption and destruction.
There was a hand or two in the back corner, I think. If not, let's just take those two.
Sure. Well, I would say looking at the big picture of what's going on with indigenous autonomy and indigenous struggles, what we were talking about is kind of a specific case study with Mapuche and a number of in Brazil. It's about tree plantations, but if you look at the larger picture, it's really about business as usual, how to maintain business as usual, and the majority of the intact forests and resources that remain on the planet are on indigenous people's lands. Whether they're titled or untitled, they're on indigenous people's lands, the lands where indigenous peoples live or have traditionally lived. And because of that, we have what's called 30 by 30. Have people heard of 30 by 30? So that's this idea we're going to conserve 30% of the planet's terrestrial land by 2030. And the lands that they're looking at are indigenous people's lands. But the model that's being applied is the human exclusion model, which means that if we're to protect the land, the people have to go.
Right.
Because the people might use a tree,
Right.
So, it's a horribly destructive model that, or threat to indigenous peoples that is being projected as this great thing that's going to save the planet, it's going to save forests, it's going to do all of this wonderful stuff, save biodiversity. But in fact, the lands on the planet, and this has been shown in a few different studies, 80% of biodiversity is found on indigenous people's lands. And the reason for that is because there are people there to protect that land. Not because it's a human exclusion zone with a fence around it, it's because people are there to protect that land. And when the people are removed, the land is then vulnerable to illegal logging, illegal mining, resource extraction. The land becomes, the land gets destroyed in many cases.
In some cases, overpopulation of other species.
Yeah.
Can I just add that in my sense that they're not just protecting the land, but when humans are connected to their indigeneity, they're generating biodiversity.
Well, exactly. Well, yeah. I mean, it's not like people are protecting the land. It's people are the land. It's a one system kind of a thing. But for lack of a better term, like I said, 6 presentations in 5 days or 5 presentations. Anyway, sorry. So, so 30 by 30 is an example of that. So, but what I'm trying to get at though is greenwashing is probably the biggest threat to indigenous people right now. I would say on the planet, this greenwashing, business as usual. So in Chile, we talked about the timber plantations, which are being greenwashed as necessary for, as I said, the bioeconomy, all of these bioproducts, carbon offsets, blah, blah, blah. But they're also the Atacama Desert, which is the driest desert in the world. It's not on Mapuche territory, it's on the territory of the Atacama people in Chile. And that land is being totally destroyed for lithium mining. It's part of the lithium triangle down there where there's huge deposits of lithium for electric cars, solar panels, etc., electric batteries. And they're destroying the rivers for hydroelectricity, you know, because it's green energy. And that's just in Chile. And this is happening on indigenous land, you know, there's lithium mining in the United States on indigenous land. So it's really, it's the bioeconomy, this idea that we can technologize, that's not a word, ourselves out of climate change, you know, through electricity, electric whatevers. This is, I think, the biggest threat to indigenous people's land and autonomy right now, aside from what the historic, you know, struggles have been of indigenous peoples. Sorry, that was an oversimplification, but I'm just so tired.
Just real quickly, that this doesn't, this is something that's happening. We were just in Upper Peninsula of Michigan, actually in the Keweenaw Peninsula, which is right on the tip. It used to be the biggest copper production, I guess, in the world, was it? I mean, I'm not sure if it was in the world, but it was the major copper industry, and then copper no longer was such a big thing. While we were there maybe a month ago, we were staying on the lake, and you could see helicopters go over and back and forth and back and forth. They're doing this all over because they're trying to figure out where the copper is now, because they want to come back and do more copper mining, because of this green revolution of we'll do everything clean, and none of this shit works. It's just it's amazing the amount of false information that's out there. It is absolutely, and that's in everything. I mean,
We're just at the edge of our time. If there's a burning question, we can squeeze in one more. But we need to set up for the next session, which is a little complicated because we have a speaker zooming in from Germany. Alexis?
This is a closing gratitude, and I just wanted to say that your exhaustion, despite your exhaustion, the brilliance and the amazing presence of you in person it's awe-inspiring, and I feel like this is an incredible family reunion. It was kind of a miracle to even land here today in person for you, but definitely for me and others, and people have come from all different places, but you know, our alma mater, the Institute, you, just the overview of the work, and it was just going down fucking memory lane of, yeah, it was behind that, and we were under that, and we were in that, and we built that, and it's just so amazing what we've all done, but mostly what you guys are freaking still out there doing so strongly and powerfully, and it's really amazing that you came back for us, and that it means so much happened in Vermont and has happened for so long and is still happening. And for many of you, I worked at Bread and Puppet Theater for almost 40 years now, and so that, you know, that enclave, it's just, it's a powerful time that you are here, and I'm so grateful, we're all so grateful for the energy that you put out to make this happen. And so I wanted to say thank you, and thank you for mentioning Mumia, because, you know, he has his...
He's still in jail. He's still resisting.
Yeah, it's a great way to listen, radio.
and Alexis,
Prison radio.
I will give you the check we said we would give you if you paid it.
You have the handkerchief, but thank you. All right.
All right, well, let's thank Ann and Lauren again.
It's really, really good to be here and see old friends and new people that are coming in. And all I can say is we're up against the biggest challenge I think most of us have ever seen. And as far as living in this country now as activists, as just people, and I don't think people really realize how bad it is, but I hope I'm wrong, because I'm tired of telling people I told you so in the end, but I hope I'm wrong.
One quick announcement before we split up is that there are people who need rides tomorrow. Blair and Max both need to get to Burlington tomorrow afternoon. So if anybody is heading in that direction or can make an extra trip and help them get to the airport tomorrow, that's really important. And there was some text dialogue about maybe getting a bigger sheet up for people who need rides or can offer rides, especially tomorrow. So we will get set up.
Can I
Yeah,
just,
well, let me just, after Ann's announcement about the books, we will take a 10-minute break and set up for the next session.
And iced coffee inside.
yes.
Brian, can we set aside a little time to get introductions? We have some new arrivals.
Yeah, let's do that at the beginning of the next session,
So
definitely.
there's a bunch of literature up here. I hope people will check out, and if you're interested in purchasing Oren's book, he will do a signing while things are being transformed into the next session. There's Earth Island Journal article about the Darling 50, it's called the D58 debacle, Darling 58 debacle. Executive summary from our report that we did about the genetically engineered American chestnut and a variety of other things. So, check those out. We have a sign-up sheet if you want to stay in contact with us. That would be lovely. And other than that, yeah, that's it.